The carriage jolted hard over a broken stone, and Eleanor Whitmore's small bag of belongings slid off the seat and struck her ankle. She barely noticed. Her hands were pressed together in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, and her eyes were fixed on the letter her mother had placed in her palm before she left home. "Marry well, Eleanor, marry quickly. We do not have the luxury of time." Those words had followed her the entire journey from Kent to London, repeating themselves every time the wheels struck a rut in the road. Her father had died 8 months earlier, and with him had gone the last of the family's careful arrangements with the bank. What remained was a house they could not keep, a stack of unpaid accounts, and a mother whose hands shook now whenever she opened the post. Eleanor was 20 years old, and she had been sent to London not to enjoy a season of dancing and pleasant conversation, but to find a husband before the family's debt swallowed them whole. She arrived at her aunt's townhouse in Mayfair just as the sun was setting behind the rooftops, and she had barely set down her trunk before her aunt, a sharp-eyed woman named Constance Ridley, was already speaking of a ball 3 nights hence. "The Ashworth ball," her aunt said, walking briskly through the hall as though speed itself might solve the family's troubles. "Every eligible gentleman in London will be there. You must be seen, Eleanor. You must be remembered." "I understand," Eleanor said quietly. "Do you?" "Because your mother's letters suggest you have spent more time reading novels than practicing your steps." Eleanor said nothing. There was no point arguing. She had come to London because there was no other choice, and she intended to do what was asked of her, however little she wanted it. 3 nights later, she stood at the edge of a ballroom so bright with candlelight that it made her eyes ache. Silk gowns in every color moved past her like a river she did not know how to enter. She had never felt so aware of being watched and so completely invisible at the same time. "Straighten your shoulders," her aunt murmured beside her, "and smile. Gentlemen do not approach women who look as though they are attending a funeral." Eleanor forced the corners of her mouth upward, though her stomach was tight with nerves. She scanned the room, searching for a face that might be kind, or at least patient enough to overlook her unfamiliarity with London society. That was when she noticed him. He stood near one of the tall windows, apart from the crowd, dressed in dark clothing that made no attempt to compete with the brightness around him. He was not laughing with the other gentlemen near the refreshment table, nor was he engaged in the careful, performative conversations happening throughout the room. He simply watched, still and quiet, like a man who had learned long ago how to be present without being part of anything. "Who is that?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. Her aunt followed her gaze, and her expression shifted immediately, sharpening with interest. "That," she said, lowering her voice, "is the Duke of Ashcombe, Alistair Vane. He rarely attends events such as this. I am rather surprised to see him here at all. Why does he keep himself apart? No one truly knows. He inherited the title young, after his father's death, and since then he has kept mostly to himself. There have been rumors, of course, there always are, about a man with a title and no wife." Her aunt's eyes glittered. "But a duke is a duke, Eleanor. If he so much as looks in your direction tonight, you smile." Eleanor did not have to wait long. Not 10 minutes later, as she stood near the edge of the dance floor trying to appear at ease, she felt a shift in the air beside her, and turned to find the Duke standing not 2 feet away, regarding her with an expression she could not quite read. "You are new to London," he said. It was not a question. "Is it so obvious? You are the only person in this room who has not once glanced toward the mirror across the hall to check her reflection." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his mouth. "I find that rather refreshing." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, unsure whether she had just been complimented or quietly studied. "I did not realize I was being observed so closely, Your Grace. Forgive me. It is a habit I have not managed to break." He extended a gloved hand toward the dance floor, where couples were beginning to form new lines for the next set. "Would you do me the honor?" Around them, Eleanor was suddenly and acutely aware of heads turning. Whispers rippled outward like water disturbed by a stone. A duke, dancing with an unknown woman fresh from the countryside, one who had not even been in London a full week, was not a small thing to witness. She placed her hand in his, and they moved onto the floor. He danced with the same quiet control that marked everything else about him, precise and unhurried, his eyes remaining on her face rather than drifting over the room the way most gentlemen's did. There was something steady in the way he held himself, but beneath that steadiness, Eleanor thought she caught something else. Attention, carefully hidden, the way a man moves when he is listening for a sound he hopes will not come. "You dance as though you would rather be doing anything else," she said, testing him. On the contrary, his eyes met hers directly. "This is the first evening in a long while that I have wanted to be exactly where I am. The words settled somewhere in her chest, warm and unfamiliar. She did not know what to do with them, so she said nothing, and let the music carry them through the rest of the dance. When the set ended, he bowed over her hand and thanked her, his fingers lingering a moment longer than propriety strictly required before he released her. Then, without another word, he turned and made his way back toward the edge of the room, back toward the shadows near the window where she had first noticed him. Eleanor watched him go, her pulse still unsteady, and it was only then that she noticed the other man. He stood near the far wall, half hidden behind a pillar, and unlike everyone else in the ballroom, he was not looking at the dancers or the refreshments or the glittering chandeliers overhead. He was watching the Duke, with an expression so cold and so fixed that it startled her. There was no warmth in his face at all, only a kind of patient, waiting anger, the sort a man carries for years before he finally acts on it. As if sensing her attention, the man's eyes shifted, and for one brief, unsettling moment, they met hers. He did not look away. He held her gaze with a faint, humorless smile, as though he already knew something about her that she had not yet learned herself. Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Eleanor. Her aunt's voice cut sharply through her thoughts, and she turned to find the older woman practically vibrating with excitement. Do you have any notion of what has just happened? The Duke of Ashcombe does not dance. He has not danced with a single woman in 3 years, and tonight he chose you. It was only one dance, Aunt Constance. It is never only one dance, not with him. Her aunt took her arm and steered her toward a quieter corner of the room, speaking rapidly under her breath. Every mother in London has tried to place her daughter in his path, and every single one has failed. He is careful, Eleanor. Deliberate. If he singled you out, it was not by accident. Eleanor glanced back toward the window where the Duke had returned to his solitary post, and found, to her surprise, that he was already looking at her again. He did not smile this time. His expression was harder to name, something between curiosity and caution, as though he too was trying to understand why he had crossed the room to speak to her at all. She thought of the man behind the pillar, the coldness in his stare, and a small, uneasy feeling settled beneath her ribs, one she could not explain and did not yet have the words for. Whatever kindness the Duke had shown her tonight, whatever warmth had passed between them during that single dance, she had the distinct sense that she had just stepped into something far larger and far more dangerous than a simple London season. The carriage ride home was quiet. Her aunt talked without pause about strategy and opportunity and the calling cards that would surely arrive by morning, but Eleanor barely heard her. She sat with her forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the dark streets pass by, and she thought of the Duke's steady voice and the stranger's cold, knowing smile, and wondered which one of them would shape the course of what came next. She did not yet know that within a fortnight, both men would return to her life, and that neither of them would let her leave it easily. 2 days later, a note arrived at her aunt's townhouse, sealed with a crest Eleanor did not recognize until her aunt gasped and pressed a hand to her chest. "The Ashcombe seal," she whispered. "He has written to you directly." Eleanor broke the seal with trembling fingers. The letter was brief, formal in its wording, and yet there was something in the careful phrasing that felt deliberate, as though every word had been chosen with unusual care. He requested the honor of calling upon her the following afternoon. She read it twice before folding it closed, and for a long moment she simply sat with it in her lap, staring at nothing, caught somewhere between hope and an unease she could not quite name. Whatever waited for her in the weeks ahead, she understood, with a strange and sudden clarity, that her life had already begun to change, and there would be no simple way to turn back. The Duke arrived precisely at the hour he had promised, not a minute early and not a minute late, and Eleanor found herself oddly unsettled by his punctuality. It suggested a man who measured his days carefully, who left little to chance, and she wondered what it might take to unsettle such a man. He was shown into the drawing room by her aunt's butler, and for the first few minutes the visit proceeded exactly as such visits were meant to. He inquired after her journey to London. She asked polite questions about his estate in the north. Her aunt sat nearby with her needlework, offering the occasional comment, though Eleanor suspected she was listening far more closely than she appeared to be. It was only when her aunt was called briefly from the room to attend to some household matter that the conversation shifted into something less rehearsed. "You seem surprised that I called," the Duke said, once they were alone. "I confess I am. My aunt tells me you rarely pay such visits." "That is true." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. "I have spent a great deal of time avoiding exactly this sort of thing. Introductions, expectations, the slow, careful dance that society insists upon before two people are permitted to know one another honestly. And yet here you are. Here I am, A faint, rueful smile crossed his face. I have asked myself the same question more than once since the ball. Eleanor found herself smiling in return, though a small part of her remained cautious. There was something in the careful way he chose his words, something guarded beneath the warmth, that made her feel as though she were only ever seeing a fraction of the man in front of her. "May I ask you something forward, Your Grace?" "You may." Why does a duke who avoids society choose to seek out a woman he does not know, at a ball he did not wish to attend? For a moment, something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it. Then he set his teacup down with careful precision and met her eyes. "Because for the first time in a long while, I wanted something for myself, rather than for the sake of duty." He paused. "That is the truth, though I understand it is not a complete answer. It is an honest one, at least. I hope you will find that I am, generally, an honest man." There was a weight to the words that Eleanor did not fully understand, as though he were making her a promise he was already unsure he could keep. Over the following 2 weeks, the Duke called upon her 4 more times, and each visit deepened both her fondness for him and her uncertainty. He was attentive in a way that felt genuine rather than performed, asking after her thoughts on books and music and the small details of her life in Kent as though he truly wished to know her, not merely to secure a suitable match. He remembered small things she mentioned in passing and returned to them days later, which touched her more than any grand gesture could have. And yet alongside the growing warmth between them, small strange details began to gather in Eleanor's mind, like stones collecting at the bottom of a still pond. The first was during a visit to his townhouse, where she had been invited, with her aunt as chaperone, to view a small collection of paintings his mother had once favored. As they moved down a long corridor on the 2nd floor, Eleanor noticed a door at the far end, heavier than the others, fitted with a lock that seemed unusually secure for what appeared to be an ordinary room. "What is kept there?" she asked, more out of idle curiosity than suspicion. The Duke's expression shifted, just slightly, before smoothing back into pleasant neutrality. "Old estate records, nothing of interest, I assure you." It was a reasonable answer, and yet something in the swiftness of his reply, the way his shoulders had gone rigid for the briefest moment, told her it was not the whole truth. The second incident troubled her more. During that same visit, as they passed through the servants' corridor on their way to the garden, a young housemaid rounded the corner too quickly and nearly collided with the Duke. The girl startled so violently at the sight of him that she dropped the linens she was carrying and stammered an apology with trembling hands, her eyes wide with something that looked unmistakably like fear. "Forgive her," the Duke said quietly once the girl had gathered herself and hurried away. "The staff have had a difficult season." "She looked terrified," Eleanor said carefully. "She is young and easily startled. It is nothing more than that." Eleanor wanted to believe him. She wanted, quite badly, to believe that the man who spoke to her with such warmth and looked at her with such open admiration was exactly who he presented himself to be. But she had grown up watching her own household unravel slowly beneath a surface of forced calm, and she recognized, with an unease she could not shake, the particular quality of a house holding its breath. The third incident occurred a few nights later, and it was the one that lodged itself most firmly in her thoughts. She had stayed later than intended at a small gathering hosted by a family friend 2 streets from the Duke's townhouse, and as her aunt's carriage rolled past his residence on the way home, Eleanor happened to glance toward the building and saw a figure being admitted through a side entrance rarely used by guests. The visitor wore a dark hooded cloak despite the mild evening, his face deliberately obscured, and he moved with the quick, furtive steps of a man who did not wish to be recognized. The Duke himself opened the door, glancing once up and down the street, before drawing the visitor quickly inside. Eleanor sat frozen against the carriage seat, her heart beating strangely fast, long after the townhouse had disappeared from view. She told herself there could be 100 innocent explanations: a private matter of business, a family friend who valued discretion, a late-night visit from a physician perhaps, if someone in the household had taken ill. But she could not fully convince herself, and the image stayed with her, the hooded figure and the Duke's watchful, careful glance up and down the empty street, like a man checking to see whether he had been observed. At their next meeting, held in the small private garden behind her aunt's townhouse, Eleanor found herself watching him more closely than before, searching his face for some sign of what lay beneath his careful composure. "You seem thoughtful today," he observed as they walked slowly along the garden path. "I have been thinking about how little I truly know of you, Your Grace, despite the kindness you have shown me." He was quiet for a moment. "What would you like to know? Why your household seems so careful? Why your staff startles so easily?" Why a man who claims to value honesty keeps a locked door in his own home that he will not explain. His steps slowed, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance beyond the garden wall. There are things in my life, he said finally, choosing each word with visible care, that I am not yet able to share, even with someone I have come to care for as deeply as I have come to care for you. It is not a matter of trust, Eleanor. It is a matter of protection, for people who are not mine alone to protect. Protection from what? From a danger I have carried since before I inherited this title, one I hoped, foolishly perhaps, that I could keep entirely separate from any life I might build beyond it. Eleanor studied his face, searching for deception and finding, instead, something that looked closer to quiet exhaustion, the weight of a man who had carried a heavy burden alone for far too long. I am not asking you to hand me every secret you hold, she said softly. But I would ask you not to pretend there is nothing there at all. I would rather stand beside a difficult truth than be comforted by an easy lie. Something shifted in his expression then, something that looked almost like relief, though it was tangled with a sorrow she did not yet understand. You are unlike anyone I have met in a very long time, he said quietly. Is that a compliment, Your Grace? It is the truth. He reached out, briefly, and took her hand in his grip warm and steady despite the tension still visible in his shoulders. Give me time, Eleanor. I promise you, in time, you will understand everything. I only ask that you trust me a little longer, until I am certain it is safe to tell you the rest. She wanted to trust him completely. Standing there in the quiet garden, with his hand wrapped around hers and his eyes fixed on her face with such open sincerity, it would have been easy to simply agree, to set aside every strange detail and let herself believe in the warmth growing steadily between them. But as she walked back inside that evening, she could not stop thinking of the hooded figure slipping through the side door, and the cold, patient smile of the stranger who had watched the Duke so intently at the ball, as though waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Whatever secret the Duke was protecting, Eleanor was beginning to understand that it was not hidden merely from society. It was hidden from an enemy who had already found his way close enough to watch. The invitation to Ashcombe Manor arrived a week later, written in the Duke's own hand rather than dictated to a secretary, and Eleanor understood, from the careful way her aunt read and reread the letter, that this was no small gesture. A visit to a Duke's country estate, even with a proper chaperone in attendance, was a clear signal to all of society that his intentions were serious. The journey north took the better part of 2 days, and by the time the carriage passed through the tall iron gates of Ashcombe Manor, the sun was low and golden across the fields, catching on the stone towers of a house far older and far grander than Eleanor had imagined. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress that had slowly, over centuries, learned to soften its edges. The Duke met them himself in the courtyard, his manner warmer here than she had yet seen it, as though the walls of his family home allowed him to set down some portion of the careful control he maintained in London. "Welcome to Ashcombe," he said, offering his hand to help her down from the carriage. "I hope the journey was not too tiring. It was long, but the countryside was beautiful. It has always been my favorite part of the year here." The fields turned gold just before harvest. He glanced toward the house behind him, and something in his expression grew briefly distant. "I hope you will find as much to admire in the house as in the land around it." Dinner that evening was a quiet affair, attended only by the Duke, Eleanor, her aunt, and the Duke's elderly aunt, Lady Marguerite, who lived at the manor as its senior lady, and who watched Eleanor throughout the meal with sharp, assessing eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of the stranger from the ballroom. "You have a determined look about you," Lady Marguerite said finally, over the second course. "That is good. This family has had enough of quiet, agreeable women who ask no questions." "Aunt Marguerite," the Duke said, a note of warning in his voice. "I am simply making an observation, Alistair. There is no harm in honesty at one's own table." The old woman turned back to Eleanor, her gaze unwavering. "Has my nephew told you anything of substance about this family, my dear, or has he kept you at the same careful distance he keeps everyone?" Eleanor glanced at the Duke, whose jaw had tightened visibly. "He has told me there are things he is not yet able to share." "Ah." Lady Marguerite's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Some truths are better told sooner than later, before circumstances force the telling." The Duke set down his fork with more force than necessary. "This is not the appropriate conversation for dinner." The old woman said nothing further, but her eyes lingered on Eleanor a moment longer, heavy with something that looked almost like sympathy, before she returned her attention to her plate. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor rose from her bed and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. intending only to find a quiet corner of the house where she might sit with her thoughts. The manor at night was vast and unfamiliar, its corridors lit only by scattered candles left burning low in wall sconces, and she moved carefully, uncertain of her way. She had not intended to wander far, but a soft, muffled sound drew her attention, a voice, low and urgent, coming from behind a partially closed door at the end of a corridor she did not recognize. Drawn by curiosity she knew she should resist, she crept closer, and through the gap in the door she saw the Duke standing at a heavy wooden desk, a single candle burning beside him, his shoulders bent over what appeared to be an old leather ledger. "We cannot continue paying this indefinitely," said a second voice, belonging to a man she did not recognize, standing just out of her line of sight. "Sooner or later, someone will ask where the money is going. Then we will manage it as we always have," the Duke said, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. "I will not have this exposed. Not now. Not when I have finally found something worth protecting outside of it." "You mean the girl?" "I mean Eleanor, yes." A pause, heavy with something Eleanor could not name. "If this comes out before I am able to tell her myself, in my own words, I will lose her entirely, and I could not blame her for it." "You are playing a dangerous game, Alistair, keeping secrets from a woman you intend to marry." "I am aware of the danger, better than anyone." Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she feared it might give her away. She retreated quietly down the corridor, her mind spinning with questions she had no answers for. A ledger. Payments made in secret, for years it seemed. A truth so dangerous that its exposure might cost him everything, including her. She returned to her room and lay awake long into the night, turning the fragments over in her mind, trying and failing to assemble them into something whole. The following afternoon, while the Duke was occupied with estate business, Eleanor took the opportunity to walk the gardens alone, hoping the fresh air might clear her thoughts. It was there, near a stone bench beneath an old oak tree, that she encountered a man she did not expect to see so far from London. He stood near the garden wall, dressed simply enough to pass for a groundskeeper at a distance, but as she drew closer, she recognized him immediately. The cold, watching stranger from the ballroom. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his tone pleasant in a way that did not match the calculation in his eyes. "I did not expect to find you wandering the grounds alone. I do not believe we have been introduced." "Gerald Price, at your service." He offered a shallow bow. "An old acquaintance of the Ashcombe family, though acquaintance may be too generous a word." Eleanor's unease sharpened. "What are you doing here, Mr. Price?" "Walking, much as you are, thinking about the past, and how strangely it has a way of returning to collect what it is owed." He studied her with open interest. "You seem like an intelligent young woman. Has the Duke told you anything of his father?" "His father passed some years ago, I understand." "He did, though not before leaving behind a great deal more than a title." Price's smile thinned. "Ask him sometime, Miss Whitmore, what became of the Price family fortune, and why my own father died believing himself ruined by a man he once called a friend." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them, and Price's expression shifted instantly back into pleasant neutrality. "A pleasure as always," he said smoothly, and slipped away through a gap in the garden wall, just as the Duke rounded the corner, his face darkening the moment he caught sight of the retreating figure. "What did he say to you?" the Duke demanded, closing the distance between them quickly, his eyes scanning her face with visible alarm. "He mentioned your father, and something about the Price family fortune." The Duke's expression closed like a door slamming shut. For a long moment he said nothing, staring past her toward the wall where Price had disappeared, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "He should not be on this property," he said finally, his voice tight and controlled in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. "I will have the grounds searched." "I am sorry, Eleanor. I did not intend for you to be troubled by any of this." "Alistair." It was the first time she had used his given name aloud, and it seemed to catch him off guard, his eyes flicking to hers with something raw and unguarded. "I heard you last night, in the study. I did not mean to listen, but I heard enough to know there is a ledger, and payments, and a secret you are protecting at a considerable cost." He was quiet for a long moment, his expression a battle between the instinct to deny and the exhaustion of a man who had carried a burden alone for far too long. "Walk with me," he said finally. They moved together along the garden path, further from the house, until the manor stood distant behind them and only the wide, quiet fields surrounded them on every side. "My father was not the man history remembers him as," he began slowly. "He was charming, and clever, and deeply in debt for most of his adult life. though he hid it well enough that even I did not know the truth until after his death. Gerald Price's father was his closest friend, and his primary source of investment capital for a scheme my father promised would secure both their fortunes. What happened? The scheme failed. Or rather, my father ensured it appeared to fail, while quietly redirecting a significant portion of the investment into his own accounts before the losses were ever made public. Price's father lost nearly everything. He took his own life 2 years later, unable to bear the shame of what he believed was simply poor judgment on his part. The Duke's voice had gone hollow. I did not learn the truth of what my father had done until I found his private papers, nearly a year after I inherited the title. And the payments? Restitution. As much as I have been able to quietly return to the Price family, through channels designed to avoid drawing attention, I could not undo what my father did, and I could not clear his name without destroying what little remains of it publicly, along with my mother's peace and my sister's prospects for a respectable marriage. So I have paid, quietly, for years, hoping it might be enough to satisfy Gerald Price's grievance before it became public. It clearly has not been enough. No. He turned to face her fully, his expression stripped of the careful composure he usually wore like armor. Gerald wants more than money now, Eleanor. He wants the truth exposed, publicly, in a way that will ruin what remains of my family's name, regardless of what it costs him in the process, and I fear he intends to use you to accomplish it. A cold weight settled in Eleanor's chest. Use me how? I do not yet know, but he approached you today for a reason, and Gerald Price does nothing without careful calculation. The Duke reached for her hand, holding it with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the tension in his voice. I should have told you sooner. I was afraid that if you knew the truth of what my family carries, you would see me the way Gerald wants you to see me, as nothing more than my father's son, continuing a legacy of deception. I do not see you that way. You may yet, before this is finished. Eleanor tightened her grip on his hand, steadying herself against the fear that had settled beneath her ribs. Then let us finish it together, rather than you carrying it alone. For the first time since she had met him, the Duke's carefully guarded composure gave way entirely, and something raw and grateful passed across his face before he drew her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. You may come to regret that offer, he said quietly. I do not think I will, she answered, though even as she spoke the words, she could not shake the image of Gerald Price's cold, patient smile, and the certain knowledge that whatever came next would not be simple, and would not be safe. The letter arrived 3 days after Eleanor returned to London, delivered not by post but by an unfamiliar boy who pressed it into the hand of her aunt's housemaid and vanished before anyone could question him. Eleanor recognized the handwriting the moment she broke the seal, though she had seen it only once before, scrawled hastily across a card left at her aunt's door the previous week, with no signature at all. The message inside was brief and precise, each word chosen with the same cold calculation she had sensed in Gerald Price from the very first moment she saw him watching the Duke from behind a pillar. He wrote that he knew of her growing attachment to Alistair Vane, and that he took no pleasure in what he was about to demand of her. He wrote that the Duke's father had destroyed his family with a lie dressed in friendship, and that the debt owed could not be settled with quiet payments made in the dark, hidden from the very society that deserved to know the truth. He wrote that if she did not withdraw from the match within the week, publicly and without explanation, he would ensure that every detail of the Vane family's deception reached every drawing room and printing press in London, and that her own reputation, tied now so closely to the Duke's, would suffer the same ruin. He signed it simply, Gerald Price, as though there were nothing shameful in what he had just threatened. Eleanor sat with the letter in her lap for a long time after reading it, her hands trembling slightly, her mind racing through every possible path forward and finding each one narrower and more dangerous than the last. She did not show the letter to her aunt. Instead, she requested the carriage that same afternoon and asked to be taken directly to the Duke's townhouse. Propriety be damned. She could not sit quietly with this knowledge while pretending nothing had changed. The Duke received her immediately, and the moment he saw her face, his own expression shifted from surprise to alarm. What has happened? She handed him the letter without a word, and watched as his face grew pale, then hard, his jaw tightening as he read it a second time, as though searching for some detail that might soften its meaning. He would not dare, he said finally, though the words sounded more like a hope than a certainty. He has already dared once, approaching me directly at your own estate. I do not believe he intends to stop simply because we ask him to. The Duke set the letter down on the table between them with careful, controlled movements, though Eleanor could see the tension radiating from every line of his body. I will speak with him, I will offer him whatever he asks for, whatever sum will finally satisfy this. He does not want money, Alistair. He told you that himself, and he has told me the same. He wants the truth exposed, and he intends to use me to force your hand. She stepped closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. What happens if I simply withdraw, as he demands? Would that be enough to satisfy him? I do not know, and I will not ask you to sacrifice yourself to find out. It is not your decision alone to make. Perhaps not. He turned away from her, moving toward the window, his shoulders rigid. But I will not stand by and watch you destroyed for a crime my father committed before either of us were old enough to understand what he had done. This is my burden, Eleanor, not yours. It became mine the moment you asked me to trust you. Her voice was steady despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. You told me, in your garden, that you did not want to protect me by keeping me at a distance. You wanted me to stand beside the truth, not be shielded from it. Do not change your mind now, simply because the truth has grown teeth. He turned back to face her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of the choice settling heavily between them. There is more you should know, he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier control. Before I can decide how to answer Gerald's demand, you deserve to understand the full truth of what my father did, not merely the fragments I gave you at Ashcombe. He gestured toward a chair, and Eleanor sat, bracing herself for whatever remained unsaid. My father did not simply mismanage an investment, the Duke began. He forged documents, falsified records to make it appear that the investment scheme he and Gerald's father built together had failed through poor market conditions, when in truth, he had quietly withdrawn the majority of the funds months before the collapse, and redirected them into properties held under a false name. It was not carelessness, it was a deliberate, calculated theft, dressed carefully enough that even skilled investigators found nothing amiss at the time. How did you discover it? His private study, after his death. A locked drawer I nearly overlooked, containing letters between him and a solicitor who had helped arrange the false transactions. I read enough that night to understand exactly what he had done, and exactly what it would mean if it ever became public. His hands tightened at his sides. The scandal alone would have been damaging enough. But there is a second matter, one even Gerald does not yet fully understand, that makes the truth far more dangerous than simple theft. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her. What matter? The properties my father purchased with the stolen funds were never fully liquidated. Some remain, quietly held under false names, worth a considerable sum. If that is discovered alongside the truth of how they were acquired, it will not merely be scandal. It will be grounds for criminal prosecution against my father's memory and potentially against the estate itself, should the courts determine that the title inherited the proceeds of his crime along with everything else. You could lose Ashcombe entirely. I could lose everything. My title, my mother's home, my sister's prospects for any respectable future at all. He met her eyes, and the fear she saw there was more honest than anything he had shown her before. This is what I have been protecting, Eleanor. Not merely my family's pride, but their survival. And now Gerald holds the power to destroy it, simply by speaking the truth aloud in the right rooms. Eleanor sat with the weight of it for a long moment, her mind working through the tangled threads of fear and loyalty and the growing certainty that there was no path forward that did not carry real danger. Then we must find a way to face it on our own terms, she said finally, before Gerald forces our hand entirely. How? I do not know yet, but hiding has already failed you for years. Perhaps it is time to try something else. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, equal parts fear and fragile hope. You would stand beside this, knowing everything it might cost you? I already told you I would. She reached for his hand, steadying them both. The question now is not whether I will stand beside you, Alistair. It is what we intend to do before Gerald Price decides the timing for us. Outside, the light was beginning to fade toward evening, and somewhere across the city, Eleanor knew, Gerald Price was already counting the days remaining before his deadline arrived, patient and certain that the truth, once loosed, could not be called back. She did not yet know how they would answer him, but she understood, with a clarity that steadied her more than it frightened her, that whatever came next would determine not only the Duke's future, but her own, irrevocably, and there was no version of safety left that did not require facing Gerald Price directly. The whispers began before the week's deadline had even passed. Eleanor first noticed the shift at a small afternoon gathering hosted by her aunt's closest friend, where conversations that had once flowed easily around her now paused and stumbled the moment she entered a room. Ladies who had greeted her warmly only days before offered stiff, uncertain smiles, their eyes darting toward one another in ways that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with dread. "Something is wrong," she said quietly to her aunt as they climbed into the carriage afterward. I could feel it the entire visit. Her aunt's face was drawn with a worry she did not bother to hide. "There is a rumor circulating, Eleanor. I have heard fragments of it from 3 separate sources today alone. Something about the late Duke of Ashcombe, and money that vanished under suspicious circumstances many years ago." Eleanor's heart sank. Gerald Price had not waited for his deadline after all, or perhaps he had simply begun laying the groundwork early, seeding doubt before delivering the full truth in one devastating blow. "How much do they know?" "Very little yet, from what I can gather. Only enough to whisper, not enough to accuse outright." Her aunt studied her carefully. "But rumors have a way of growing quickly, my dear, and growing uglier the longer they are left unanswered." By the following day, the whispers had become bolder. Eleanor received no fewer than 3 notes from acquaintances gently inquiring whether she had heard anything troubling about the Ashcombe family, each one dressed in polite concern that barely concealed an eager hunger for scandal. Her aunt's own social invitations, once arriving daily, slowed to a careful trickle, as though the households of London were quietly deciding whether continued association with the Whitmore name might prove costly. She sent word to the Duke immediately, and he arrived within the hour, his face grim, with an exhaustion that suggested he had spent the entire day fighting fires of his own. "Gerald has been busy," he said without preamble, pacing the length of her aunt's drawing room. "I have already had 2 separate acquaintances quietly withdraw invitations today, citing vague excuses that fooled no one. He is moving faster than his letter suggested he would. What do we do?" "I do not know yet. I have consulted with my solicitor this morning, hoping there might be some legal recourse, some way to silence Gerald before this grows any further, but he tells me the truth of what my father did leaves us little ground to stand on. If Gerald produces evidence, and I believe he has kept some, we cannot simply deny it away." Eleanor watched him pace, the careful composure he had always worn now visibly fraying at the edges, and she felt a fresh wave of fear settle over her, not merely for herself, but for the man in front of her, watching everything he had spent years protecting begin to unravel regardless of what he did. "Alistair." She stepped into his path, forcing him to stop. "You cannot out-argue a truth you already know is real. If Gerald has proof, denying it will only make things worse when it finally surfaces. Then what would you have me do? Confirm it publicly and hand him exactly the ruin he wants? I would have you decide, once and for all, whether you intend to keep hiding behind your father's lies, or whether you are finally ready to answer for them honestly, on your own terms, before Gerald forces the timing entirely." He stared at her, something raw and frightened moving behind his eyes. "If I confirm it, Eleanor, I risk losing everything. The title, the estate, my mother's home, everything my family has built across generations, gone in a single confession. And if you do not, you risk losing it regardless, along with any chance of controlling how the truth is finally told." She softened her voice, reaching for his hand. "I cannot make this choice for you, but I do not believe hiding has ever truly protected you, not really. It has only delayed the moment you would eventually have to face." Before he could answer, a sharp knock sounded at the drawing room door, and Eleanor's aunt entered, her face pale, a folded newspaper clutched tightly in her hand. "You should see this," she said, her voice unsteady, holding the paper out toward them. Eleanor took it with trembling fingers, and felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her, as she read the headline printed boldly across the page. It was not the full truth, not yet. The article stopped short of naming specific crimes, but it spoke plainly enough of suspicious financial dealings surrounding the late Duke of Ashcombe, and hinted at a scandal soon to unfold that would shake one of London's oldest titles to its foundation. "He has gone to the papers," the Duke said, his voice hollow with disbelief. He did not even wait for my answer. "Then the choice has already been made for you," Eleanor said quietly, setting the paper down with careful hands. "The only question remaining is whether you intend to let Gerald control the story from here, or whether you will finally speak the truth yourself, in your own words, before it is twisted into something even worse." The Duke was silent for a long moment, staring at the damning headline, and Eleanor watched years of careful control finally begin to crack beneath the weight of it. "If I do this," he said slowly, "if I stand before society and admit what my father did, admit the theft, admit the false accounts, I do not know what will remain afterward. My title may survive it. My family's name almost certainly will not in the way it once was known. And if that is the cost of finally telling the truth, Is it a cost you are prepared to pay? He looked at her then, really looked at her, as though searching her face for permission he did not yet feel entitled to ask for. Are you prepared to stand beside me if I do? Society will not be kind to either of us in the days that follow, regardless of how the truth is told. I did not come to London to marry a comfortable lie, Alistair. I came because my family needed help, yes, but I stayed because I found something in you worth staying for. If that means standing beside a difficult truth rather than a convenient falsehood, then I choose the truth, and I choose you alongside it. Something shifted in his expression then, resolve settling in where fear had been, and for the first time since the newspaper had arrived, he seemed to stand a little straighter. Then I will not wait for Gerald to finish writing this story for me, he said. I will call upon him myself, tonight, and I will tell him that I intend to speak the full truth publicly, on my own terms, before his version of it reaches every corner of London. Let me come with you. Eleanor, it may not be safe. Neither is standing here, waiting to see how much damage tonight's rumors do before morning. She held his gaze, steady and unyielding. Whatever Gerald intends, I would rather face it directly than wait helplessly to see what he does next. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded. Something like gratitude and fear tangled together behind his eyes. Very well, he said. Then let us go together, and put an end to Gerald Price's careful, patient game, before he decides the ending for us both. Outside, the evening had settled fully into darkness, London's streets glowing with scattered lamplight, and somewhere across the city, Gerald Price was likely already savoring the first ripples of scandal he had set into motion, certain that the Duke of Ashcombe would spend tonight hiding, rather than confronting him directly. He had, Eleanor thought grimly as she climbed into the waiting carriage beside Alistair, badly underestimated them both. Gerald Price's townhouse sat on a quiet street far removed from the fashionable bustle of Mayfair, its windows dark save for a single glow of candlelight in a room facing the street. The Duke's carriage drew to a halt outside it, and for a moment neither he nor Eleanor moved, both bracing themselves for whatever waited beyond the door. You do not have to come inside, the Duke said quietly, though his hand found hers in the darkness of the carriage, holding on as though he needed the steadiness as much as he was offering it. I told you already. I am not waiting outside while you face this alone. They were shown in by a servant who seemed unsurprised by their late arrival, as though Gerald had half expected the visit and instructed his household accordingly. He received them in a modest study, seated behind a desk covered in papers, a decanter of brandy at his elbow, untouched. Alistair, he said, rising slowly, his expression unreadable, and Miss Whitmore. I confess I did not expect the two of you to arrive together, given the article that has no doubt already reached your household. You did not wait for my answer, the Duke said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. I grew tired of waiting. I have waited 11 years, Alistair, since I stood beside my father's grave, and did not yet understand why he had chosen to end his own life, rather than face another day of ruin he believed was his own doing. Gerald's composure cracked slightly, grief bleeding through the careful control he usually wore. I have spent those years learning the truth slowly, piece by piece, while your family enjoyed a comfort built entirely on what was stolen from mine. Forgive me if my patience finally ran out. I have spent years trying to repay what was taken, quietly, without dragging either family through further ruin. Quiet repayment is not justice. It is merely a more comfortable form of theft, continuing in secret, while the world remains ignorant of what truly happened. Gerald's eyes moved to Eleanor, sharp and assessing. I imagine he has told you everything by now. The forged accounts, the hidden properties, all of it. He has, Eleanor said steadily. And I understand your grief, Mr. Price, and your anger. But destroying an innocent family alongside a guilty man's memory will not return what your father lost, nor will it ease whatever pain you have carried since his death. You speak as though I have not considered that. I speak as someone who has watched a family unravel under the weight of financial ruin, Mr. Price. My own father's death left my family with nothing but debts and desperation. I understand grief. I understand anger at circumstances that feel unjust and impossible to escape. But I do not believe destroying Alistair will heal what your father's loss broke in you. Something flickered across Gerald's face, a crack in the careful anger he had maintained for so long, though he quickly smoothed it away. What would you have me do instead, Miss Whitmore? Simply forgive, and allow the Vane family to continue enjoying a fortune built on my father's ruin? I would have him tell the truth, the Duke said quietly, stepping forward. Publicly, completely, Not the fragments you have already leaked to the papers, but the full account, including my father's forgeries, the stolen funds, and every property purchased with money that was never rightfully his. I intend to return what remains to your family directly, and to formally acknowledge, before all of London, exactly what my father did to yours. Gerald stared at him, clearly caught off guard by the offer. You would ruin your own family's name so completely? My family's name was already built on a lie the moment my father chose to steal from a man who trusted him. I would rather see it fall honestly than continue standing on a foundation I know to be false. The Duke's voice was steady now, stripped of the fear that had haunted it earlier that evening. I cannot undo what my father did to yours, Gerald, but I can't stop pretending it never happened, and I can ensure the truth is finally told plainly, by my own voice, rather than through rumors and half-finished newspaper articles. The room fell silent, heavy with the weight of years finally coming to a head. Gerald studied the Duke for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, grief and anger and something that looked almost like exhaustion, as though he too had grown weary of carrying this particular burden alone. I did not expect this from you, he said finally, quietly. I expected denial, excuses, perhaps another quiet payment meant to keep me silent a little longer. I am done hiding, Gerald. I have been done with it for longer than I realized, I think, until Eleanor asked me why I continued protecting a lie that was never truly mine to protect. He glanced toward her briefly, something warm passing across his exhausted features. Whatever comes next, I intend to face it honestly, and I would rather face it standing beside you than fighting against you. Gerald was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the papers scattered across his desk, before he finally spoke again, his voice rougher than before. My father was not a foolish man, Alistair. He trusted yours completely, and that trust destroyed him. I have spent 11 years believing that only ruin, matching what he suffered, could ever settle the debt between our families. He looked up, meeting the Duke's eyes directly. I am not certain that belief was ever entirely just. Then let us settle it honestly instead, the Duke said. The truth, spoken plainly, and whatever remains of the stolen funds, returned to your family in full. Not because you have forced my hand tonight, but because it is long past time I did what my father never had the courage to do himself. A long silence stretched between them, and Eleanor watched, scarcely daring to breathe, as something in Gerald Price's expression finally began to soften, years of carefully guarded anger giving way, slowly, to something closer to weary relief. Very well, Gerald said finally. Tell your truth, Alistair. I will not stand in your way, provided you tell it fully, and provided the restitution you speak of is more than another quiet arrangement meant to satisfy me alone. You have my word. Gerald's gaze shifted briefly to Eleanor, something like reluctant respect crossing his features. You are a braver woman than most of London gives you credit for, Miss Whitmore, walking into this house tonight beside him. I did not come here for bravery, Mr. Price. I came because I believe the truth is worth more than the comfort of avoiding it, for all three of us. As they left Gerald Price's townhouse a short while later, the night air cool against her face, Eleanor felt the weight of the evening finally begin to loosen its grip on her chest, though she knew the hardest part of what lay ahead had not yet truly begun. Thank you, the Duke said quietly, as the carriage pulled away from the curb. For standing beside me tonight. I do not believe I could have faced him alone, not truthfully. You did not have to. She took his hand, steady and warm in the darkness. Whatever comes next, when you tell your truth publicly, I intend to stand beside you then as well. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a slow, grateful kiss against her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. Then perhaps, he said softly, the hardest part of this has already passed, and what remains is simply the courage to say aloud what we have already decided together. Eleanor smiled despite the exhaustion pulling at her, and settled against the carriage seat, Alistair's hand still wrapped securely around hers, and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to feel something close to hope. The gathering the Duke arranged 3 days later was unlike any event London had seen in recent memory. Rather than waiting for another ball or private drawing room, he sent invitations to nearly every prominent household in the city, along with a brief note explaining that he wished to address, directly and publicly, the rumors that had begun circulating regarding his family's past. The ballroom at Ashcombe House had never been so full, nor so tense with anticipation. Eleanor stood near the front of the gathered crowd beside her aunt, her heart pounding as she watched Alistair climb a small raised platform usually reserved for musicians, his expression calm despite the visible weight he carried. The room quieted slowly, curious and expectant murmurs fading into silence as every eye turned toward him. I know many of you have heard fragments of a story these past days, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded room, regarding my late father and certain financial dealings from many years ago. I have not come tonight to deny those rumors, nor to offer excuses on his behalf. I have come to tell you the truth, in full, myself, rather than allow it to continue reaching you in pieces. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd, whispers rising and falling like a wave. He continued, laying out the truth with a steadiness that Eleanor knew had cost him enormous effort to maintain. He spoke of the investment scheme his father had built with a trusted friend, of the forged accounts and hidden properties, of the ruin it had brought upon the Price family, and of his own quiet efforts across the years since inheriting the title, to make what restitution he could. He spoke, too, of his decision to finally bring the matter into the open, rather than allow it to be twisted further by rumor, or used as a weapon against those he cared for. Near the edge of the crowd, Eleanor caught sight of Gerald Price, standing quietly, arms folded, watching the confession unfold with an expression that had softened considerably from the cold calculation she had first seen at the ballroom weeks earlier. When the Duke finished speaking, the room remained silent for a long, uncertain moment, and Eleanor felt her breath catch, uncertain which way the crowd's judgment might fall. It was Gerald Price who broke the silence first, stepping forward from the edge of the gathering, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed room. "I can confirm the truth of everything the Duke has just told you," he said. "My own father suffered the losses he describes, and I have spent years believing the Vane family owed us a reckoning they refused to give. Tonight they have given it, fully and honestly, and the restitution promised to my family has already begun. I do not believe further condemnation serves any purpose beyond cruelty, and I would ask this room to consider that a man is not the sum of his father's sins, particularly when he has worked so hard to correct them." The murmur that followed was different this time, softer, tinged with something closer to respect than scandal. Eleanor watched relief wash visibly across Alistair's face as he stepped down from the platform, and she moved through the crowd to meet him, taking his hand without hesitation, in full view of everyone gathered. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," he corrected, his eyes warm despite the exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "I could not have found the courage to stand up there tonight without you beside me these past weeks." Around them, the ballroom slowly returned to its usual rhythm, conversation resuming in careful, curious tones, though Eleanor noticed that far fewer eyes held judgment now than she had feared. The truth, spoken plainly and owned honestly, had disarmed the scandal in a way that hiding never could have. Later that evening, once the crowd had thinned and only a handful of guests remained, the Duke drew Eleanor aside into the quiet of the garden, the same garden where he had first begun to explain the truth he carried. "I have one more thing I must ask of you," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain in a way she had rarely heard from him. "Ask it then." He knelt slowly before her, drawing a small ring from his pocket, its stone catching the moonlight. "I do not offer you a name free of scandal, Eleanor, nor a family history without its share of sorrow. But I offer you everything else I have, honestly and completely, if you will have me." Eleanor felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes, and she nodded before she could even find the words to answer aloud. "Yes," she managed finally. "Yes, Alistair, I will have you." He rose and drew her into his arms, and as their lips met beneath the quiet moonlight, Eleanor thought of the frightened, uncertain woman who had arrived in London weeks earlier, sent only to secure her family's future through a practical marriage, and marveled at how completely that practical arrangement had transformed into something she had never dared to hope for. The following morning, the engagement of the Duke of Ashcombe to Miss Eleanor Whitmore was announced not in whispered rumor, but openly, proudly, in the very newspapers that had once threatened to destroy them both, and London, for once, had nothing but genuine warmth to offer in response. The wedding took place in early autumn, when the fields surrounding Ashcombe Manor had turned the same deep gold the Duke had once described to her on her first visit, and Eleanor stood at the entrance of the old stone chapel, feeling none of the dread she had carried on her journey to London months before. Her mother had traveled from Kent for the occasion, weeping openly through most of the ceremony, gripping Eleanor's hand tightly beforehand, and whispering that she had never imagined, when she pressed that desperate letter into her daughter's palm, that it might lead to a marriage built on genuine affection rather than mere necessity. "I only asked you to marry well," her mother said, dabbing at her eyes. "I did not dare hope you might also marry happily." "I did both, Mama," Eleanor answered, smiling, "though I confess, it took a rather more complicated path than either of us expected." Alistair waited for her at the front of the chapel, dressed simply, his eyes fixed on her with an open warmth that had, over the preceding months, become entirely familiar to her. The careful, guarded man from that first ballroom, now replaced by someone lighter, freer, no longer weighed down by a secret he had carried alone for so long. Gerald Price attended the wedding as well, seated near the front alongside his own young wife, a quiet, kind woman he had married only weeks earlier. The friendship that had grown between the two families in the months since the public confession still surprised Eleanor sometimes, though she had come to understand that shared honesty, however painful at first, had a way of building trust more durable than any pretense ever could. "I did not expect, when I first threatened to destroy your engagement," Gerald said to her privately during the wedding breakfast, "that I would one day stand here celebrating it instead. Grief has a way of narrowing our vision," Eleanor replied gently. "I am glad yours widened again before it cost either of us more than it already had. As am I." He glanced toward Alistair, who was deep in conversation with Lady Marguerite nearby. "He is fortunate to have found someone willing to stand beside difficult truths rather than run from them. I do not believe he would have found the courage to face me otherwise. I believe he would have, eventually, but I am glad I did not have to find out how long eventually might have taken." In the months that followed the wedding, life at Ashcombe settled into a rhythm neither of them had quite dared to imagine during those tense weeks of scandal and secrecy. The restitution to the Price family continued steadily, no longer hidden behind false names and careful discretion, but managed openly, a matter of public record rather than private shame. Lady Marguerite, satisfied at last that her nephew had chosen honesty over quiet suffering, took to Eleanor with an affection that surprised them both, teaching her the histories of the manor's older paintings and the small traditions that had shaped generations of the Vane family before her. The locked room on the second floor of the townhouse, the one that had first stirred Eleanor's suspicion so many months earlier, was finally opened and cleared, its contents, the ledgers and papers detailing the full extent of the old Duke's deception, transferred to the family solicitor for proper record-keeping, no longer hidden away like something shameful, but preserved honestly as part of the family's complicated history. Late one evening, nearly a year after their wedding, Eleanor found Alistair in his study, not bent anxiously over hidden accounts as he had been on that first night she had glimpsed him through a partially open door, but reading quietly, a small, contented smile on his face as she entered. "You look remarkably at peace," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "I find that I generally am, these days." He set his book aside, his eyes warm as they settled on her. "It is a rather unfamiliar feeling, after so many years spent guarding a secret I believed would eventually destroy everything I valued. I did not expect that telling the truth might instead be the very thing that saved it. Sometimes the things we fear most turn out to be smaller than the fear itself, once we finally face them directly. A wise observation, Duchess." He reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his thumb tracing gentle patterns against her knuckles. "Though I suspect I owe most of my current peace to the woman who refused to let me hide any longer, however much easier hiding might have seemed at the time." Eleanor smiled, leaning forward to press a soft kiss against his lips, the same steady warmth between them that had first drawn her to him across a crowded ballroom, now deepened by everything they had weathered together since. Outside, the fields of Ashcombe stretched golden beneath the evening sky, quiet and unthreatened, and Eleanor thought, with a contentment she had not dared hope for on that anxious carriage ride into London so long ago, that whatever difficulties life might yet bring them, she and Alistair had already proven, together, that they were strong enough to face them honestly, side by side, rather than alone.